Hi, everyone. So we're going out. It's a bit like, early on, and yes, this morning, it's like, oh, it's quite stressy, but actually now we're really going, and fantastic sessions, and I hope you had a good time so far today. Incredibly interesting, I found some of the sessions I've been at. Anyway, so this one, we're going to keep it fairly informal, actually. I don't need to stand here. Which is to talk about, innovation in various kinds of ways, and funds, and how do you do this stuff, and so on. So we're going to try and keep the session pretty informal. But let me introduce who's joining us for it, first of all. We will have some shape to it. So Matthew Mendelsohn here is Deputy Secretary to the Cabinet in Government of Canada. So he works to Trudeau and so on. He's actually been there for quite a while now in Canadian government, haven't you? And done lots of very interesting things. He did used to be, like me, he once upon a time was a respectable figure, the establishment academic sort of thinker, in, of course, the Moat Centre in particular, which you actually set up. But in the Canadian context, has really been the person who's pioneered a whole number of things, including the equivalent of our delivery unit, in terms of tracking. Do governments actually delivering? Is the government delivering what it said it's going to do, and to follow through in some detail, which we had pursued with Michael Barber and others in the UK. And anyway, so Matthew's been doing very much the same in relation to Canada. But also, though, you've combined, because you're also driving forward issues around innovation. And one of the things we were really fascinated about a few years ago, as between governments, we often look, I'm sure you do the same, you're like, oh, they're doing something really good, why can't we do that? And we're busy copying each other. And one of the things we were very struck by a few years ago was how the Canadians, in particular Trudeau, in his early letters of instruction to ministers said, you should experiment. You should go out and do cool new things and do all this kind of, like, oh my God, the PM is literally writing to you should do this, as opposed to we're doing kind of guerrilla action. And then there was follow-up by your Treasury too, saying not only that, like we really mean it. You should actually spend this proportion of your money and actually do this innovation stuff as well. So the Canadians, so I'm honest, with the previous Prime Minister, there wasn't very much happening in relation to experimentation and the stuff we were doing. But with Trudeau, it suddenly seemed to be absolutely just going, crazy bananas. Like, oh my God, they're going to overtake us, they're going to smash us, it's fantastic, it's brilliant. Although I think when you peep beneath the surface, it's actually, as always, it's a bit more complicated. So having Matthew here to talk about that, and this rather unusual kind of combination around delivery, innovation, behavioural insights, and so on, in a quite interesting mix, bringing it together. And as to whether maybe that's a better model than the one we ourselves pursued. So looking forward to that. And so Matthew's going to talk for a minute, and then I'll just at least briefly introduce Polly. And then after Matthew presents, we can have a bit more a discussion, and of course you can enter into that too. So Polly and I have known each other for a little while. Sorry, Matthew. I can't wait to get going. So Polly actually I knew particularly in number 10, but before that she was, the reason why she was there is because she was advising Nick Clegg and previously Ed Davey in relation to the Lib Dems. Was a journalist, actually business journalist before that. I should say she's now running the think tank Demos. But anyway, I have lots of fond memories sat in number 10 where, for those of you who don't know, we of course had a coalition government from 2010, and we had Steve Hilton, who was this quite a larger-than-life in lots of ways character advising the PM on the political side, but shared an office with Polly. So meetings were comic, really. So we go in to see either Steve or sometimes Polly, and then we'd be sat at the table, say, with Steve, and then Polly would be at the other end of the room, basically heckling. And it was really innovation and coalition government in action embodied between the two of them. So anyways, very interesting, you hear, very interesting thinker from lots of different perspectives in terms of what Demos does. And again, how do we drive forward really innovative practice in government? So I don't exactly know how this session will go, but I think it'll be really fun and interesting and entertaining, and we might learn something. So Matthew, with that in mind, over to you. You're going to lead us off, and then we'll go into discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. So I've been at the Government of Canada now for 4 years, running two different units. One is called the Results and Delivery Unit, which is similar but not exactly the same as a delivery unit that Michael Barber might have started here. And the other is the Impact and Innovation Unit, which runs our initiative on outcomes-based funding and innovative funding that's called Impact Canada Initiative, which uses a lot of behavioral science, and not unlike some of the work that David did in the UK. So we've combined those two functions, and I just want to tell you a bit about our journey over the last 4 years and kind of some of the lessons we've learned, and give you a sense of some of the things we've done, because as David mentioned, what we had, which was terribly important, was license. We had from the head of government really clear instruction to innovate, to experiment, to focus on measuring outcomes, assessing impact, all of those good things. And even with all of that, although it sounds very exciting, as David said, there are, of course, hurdles, and organizations like a federal public service do not change dramatically overnight. So I want to kind of talk you through those. I do have some slides, if we can kind of run through those, unless I am in charge of running through those. I guess I'm in charge. So that's who I am. And this is really a story of 4 years now, because we are about to drop a writ. In Canada, we have a fixed election date, which means we actually know when our election will be on October 21st. I know it's a little mysterious here at the moment, with or without fixed election dates. We will drop a writ sometime in the next couple of weeks, and the campaign will get started, and that remains a prime ministerial prerogative to go to our Governor General. But that campaign will start, and so this really is a story of a mandate with a prime minister who is interested in the kinds of things that we're interested in here. Oh my, that text is small. Oh. So what we were interested in doing was addressing some longstanding issues that everyone here is familiar with. And the thing I want to point out about both the Results and Delivery Unit and the Impact and Innovation Unit is they are both designed to deal with the same problem. They are designed to deal with the problem that government defaults to process, that government defaults to a series of rules in managing process and managing relationships, and often loses sight of the outcome or the result that one is trying to achieve. And likewise, almost all of the juice in government is around policy and communications. That is how you get promoted, that is how you succeed, that is how you build a reputation. And the focus on implementation, on program design, and also measuring impact, ensuring good outcomes, those things are very secondary. And so for us, all of these elements, the policy and the communication, which we spend so much time on as public servants, but also as ministers and cabinets, are only two of the pieces. And the equally important pieces are the program design implementation side and the measuring impact side. And what we have done at the Results and Delivery Unit is tried to mobilize government to achieve a number of key horizontal outcomes: poverty reduction, reduction of GHG emissions, improving broadband access for remote and rural communities. And we have tried to ensure that all of our efforts are mobilized around that implementation focus and ensuring results. That's at a macro level. The work that we do at Impact and Innovation is on the micro level, on thinking very clearly about program design at the early stages of integrating the questions of how are we going to design this right at the policy design stage. So, for example, at the moment, as people may be familiar with, it is one of the only things that people that I run into in markets abroad are familiar with some of the initiatives of the Canadian government recently. We have legalized cannabis. It is not really amongst our top 50 priorities, but it is certainly something that has attracted a lot of interest. And in addition to legalizing cannabis, we have introduced a regime to pardon people who had convictions for simple cannabis possession in order to improve labor market access to housing, et cetera. So as you can imagine, designing a program for pardons for people with cannabis in a traditional process, we would do a policy decision, and then leave the design and implementation of that to some later stage, often a stage that receives less attention, less profile, and less political interest. This time, those kinds of program decisions and design questions use behavioral science, thought about incentives, thought about the structure of the program in order to increase take-up so that those who have simple cannabis possessions could be aware of the program and actually take advantage of it. So those are the kinds of things we're doing on a day-to-day basis. So some of the things that we've really been trying deeply to change. We have been working hard to change the authority and rule structure that existed that prevented innovation. Again, having the head of government interested and encouraging innovation does very little to drive down within the organization when there are rules and questions of authorities about experimentation. And over again in our experiments, we confronted legal services branch, corporate services branch, administrative branches, the treasury folks within departments who said, you don't actually have the authorities to do this. You cannot do a social impact bond. You cannot do a challenge prize. You cannot do a pay for performance model. These things are prevented by the rule structure. Often that was not true. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it was simply the culture and interpretation of rules. And so what we have done is work on both the pull side and the push side. So we have created a structure and centralized what we call terms and conditions for a program that allows wide scope for innovation and experimentation. So the creation of a rule set which explicitly has cabinet approval, approval of our Treasury Board and finance that says ministers and departments are allowed to access this centralized set of flexible rules, terms and conditions to experiment. It allows us to leapfrog over the usual processes because as you can imagine, if someone has a large program and wants to experiment with a new way of delivering housing on reserve to Indigenous Canadians, the ability to seek approval and go through all of the various steps to do $1 million experiment is simply not worth the effort. But we have created simplified processes in order to do that. What we've also seen now is the creation of funds within departments, and that now total almost $1 billion Canadian dollars that are driving these innovative program and design mechanisms. It probably took us 2.5 years to get these going and to get all of the various structures in place, the incentives in place. But what we are finally seeing in our most recent budget, so in March of 2019, is kind of, I think we've taken a step change. We've kind of taken a leap now where departments, where the push and pull are both working together. So departments are not reluctantly coming on board at our initiative, at the initiative of the center, but are actually coming forward with their own initiatives based on their own priorities. So a whole series of new outcomes-based funding initiatives around increasing housing supply for low-income people in urban areas, of improving community-based infrastructure for Indigenous people on reserve, for combating extremism and hate online, for identifying better ways of growing and sustaining food and agriculture in northern Canada and remote areas. So a whole series of things that have come from departments because they have a rule structure which makes it possible. There is funding allocated. There is license. But the other piece that's been particularly important is the skills and talent. So at the beginning, it was our team of 20 or 25 people at the center that was trying to encourage and train. But what we have now done is brought people in through a centralized process and with our center of expertise, but brought these people in across the board in now, a dozen departments or so. And they form a community of practice. They meet regularly to talk about their experiments, their innovations, their outcomes-based funding, their impact evaluation models. Some of this sounds a little bit bureaucratic and process-oriented, but a lot of it is about building the skills and capacity and expertise for people to design challenges, design prizes, design social impact bonds, design pay-for-performance models, assess impact in a really rigorous way over the short and medium term, identify key targets and identify whether those are being hit. So all of these things are now in process of taking place. And from my perspective, we, over 2 years, have built this infrastructure. Kind of over the last year and a half, have started to see the combination of incentives, skills, rules, have an impact on culture. So we are seeing that departments are starting to take initiative on their own because not only do they feel they have license from the head of government and the head of public service, but we've created an environment and a rule set which enables them to do this work. We are now, I'd say, entering the third phase in our BI process. BI is one of the things we do, but increasingly we are moving from small-scale experiments to integrating behavioral science and behavioral insights into the policy-making process at a very early stage, like the cannabis example I provided, but a number of others which I'm happy to talk about. And we're very excited and hoping that these elements have now taken root within the federal public service, and regardless of the outcome of the federal election, that we have built a structure and a foundation of incentives, rules, funding, skills, and culture which will allow for ongoing experimentation, innovation, and assessment of outcomes. Obviously, it's an ongoing struggle. There are departments and organizations and leaders who are resistant, but we are seeing from the grassroots of the public service, but increasingly from senior ranks of the public service, a real embracing of the experimentation, innovation, and measuring impact, and moving away from process and moving towards ministers and deputy ministers, permanent secretaries, who regularly ask the question, not just what is the policy decision, have we gotten the process right, but how will we deliver this, and how will we know it's working, and how will we recalibrate if it's not? Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. By the way, if people want to get the slides, you should be able to get them afterwards if you want to get the detail. So, Polly, just to get us going, I wonder if you want some early responses. You know, so certainly in my team, we looked longingly across periods of what Matthew and the Canadian Trudeau's team were doing and thinking, actually, that's pretty cool, as opposed to our guerrilla operation. But what's some of your early thoughts on this balance between, trying to do the hard implementation stuff, the innovation and so on? Is the Canadian model better? Is there other ones we've seen out there? What do you think of it all?
So, I mean, I think my overall takeaway from everything you've said, and also my own kind of thinking about this, is that first, it's incredibly important for people like me or you or probably lots of people in the room to recognize that the value of a good idea is still really quite small. Even if it's the best idea you have ever had, that anybody has ever had. We can all get very, very excited about them, but even designing a streamlined, effective process for turning good ideas into implementation turns into, 5 really quite complicated slides that I can't quite read. And I guess that building those processes of converting good ideas into actual impact is unbelievably important because, even, I don't know if you saw, but David wrote something down for me and I couldn't read his handwriting. So David has a good idea. He tries to pass that good idea to me and it falls at the first hurdle because he has overestimated my ability to read words.
That's rather forgiving, I think, if you think about that.
I'm a very forgiving person, but it's interesting to think about the endless number of hurdles that are faced from that generating of a good idea, then this exciting kind of process of experimentation and implementation, and we think perhaps that because we know all about behavioural insights, that everybody does, and the way the Chinese whispers works in systems. So I remember talking to David when we were working together in government about getting appointment reminders for GPs. And all the different language that you could possibly use to get people to actually turn up to their appointment and stop wasting the NHS money. The appointment reminders I get from my GP, and they've obviously, like, somebody's read a briefing and they've got it completely wrong, because basically what it does, I can't remember the exact wording, but it just normalizes the idea. Loads and loads of people miss appointments and makes me feel like, oh, well, it's all right. And again, so in a way, probably this kind of, the everybody talking about behavioural insights, which we've been doing, very consistently since 2010, in that particular GP surgery is possibly doing more harm than good. I mean, I've just said an unevidenced statement, so I feel a bit frightened that David might kind of bite me. But it's perfectly possible. Mm-hmm. And we absolutely underestimate how profoundly difficult change is. I just came, at Demos, we have been doing a piece of research looking at how change affects well-being in the civil service. So I've just come from a roundtable with kind of 20 civil service leaders talking about change in their environments. And somebody said, oh, in the medical sphere, they just expect that it takes 17 years from creating a new technology, being kind of patient-ready, and it being normal. And again, people like me who go around advising politicians, jumping into government, come up with a good idea. Steve Hilton, who you mentioned, I remember him saying, it's a great idea, right? We should make sure that government procurement, more of it goes to small businesses, not just everything going to capita. And he wrote this sentence in the Prime Minister's speech really early on in the 2010 government. And then 6 months later, an external person came to him and said it wasn't happening. And honestly, he was flabbergasted. It's like, but the Prime Minister said it. It must have happened by now. And yet still, I share an office with this company called Spend Network, who are mapping government procurement and government contracting in order to do this. We've made like 3 percentage points of progress in 9 years. And that's really good, but it's so much work. So in a way, my overarching thought is, God, this is an important conversation to have.
Can you mind?
Yeah, no, we're having a discussion. That's the whole idea.
Well, I didn't want to... So I want to disagree a little bit.
Go ahead.
With one element, at least in our experience, and that is that the creation of the Impact and Innovation Unit and the Results and Delivery Unit were 100% designed because we did not underestimate the difficulty of change. The Prime Minister 100% internalized the fact that if he said something, and likewise our Clerk of the Privy Council Office, the Head of the Public Service, the Deputy Minister, if they say something, that doesn't mean it's going to come close to happening. And so part of it was trying to socialize with Cabinet, because Cabinet's a diverse group and caucus is a diverse group, trying to socialize with Cabinet the fact that we put something in a party manifesto, party platform, the Results and Delivery Unit has identified government commitments. They are in public mandate letters, so the Prime Minister chose to release his mandate letters to ministers. The fact that all of those things are public, those are signals, those are incentives, those create some pressure. But it was to socialize with cabinet ministers that they need kind of on a weekly basis, and this was the advice, on a weekly basis to be meeting with their senior public servants and going through their own priorities and asking, so where are we on procurement piece? Because I do liken sometimes, politicians, ministers, governments come into office, and there is an element of the public service which looks on ministers as visitors that they want to be very nice to and very helpful for and do what they want to some extent, but that at the end of the day, those ministers will be gone in 2 years or 4 years or 6 years. And so the recognition of the gap between saying something or making a policy decision and having it implemented and having it have the impact that is intended. Part of our goal is to shrink the gap between that. And so I'm not really disagreeing, but we fundamentally recognize the point you were making. And the units were not designed simply to do experiments, although those are useful. They were designed to try and drive culture change across the organization.
So, I mean, I'm very willing to believe that Canada is doing this stuff well, and there have been times when the UK has done this stuff well, and there are lots of organisations that explore this and try and support a whole range of governments to do it. The thing I understand most, I think, probably is politics, and what's troubling is there's a certain set of political dynamics that led up to 1997 and the election of our Labour government that encouraged them to hire those kind of people because they really cared about it. And that set of political dynamics, again, has factored in building this government and this political leadership in Canada and their priorities. What's frightening, potentially to me, but only from a kind of government perspective, there's plenty of non-government innovation, is that somehow the political dynamics have shifted towards politicians who actually aren't that interested in delivery. You know, the person in charge of public service reform in the United Kingdom now is an ex-blogger who's, you know, and I worry about that. That's quite different from appointing somebody like Michael Barber to worry about this stuff every day.
So why don't we're getting the first few questions also coming in, which is a great start. What we're trying to do in this discussion, and of course more generally, is to juxtapose these various things, which I think the Canadians more overtly did than many places. So on the one hand, you're a government, like, is it going to get delivered? Well, we're putting a line into a speech may not be enough. Who is going to do the follow-through, you know, which in Britain started way back in the Blair administration with deliverology. We'll have targets, you know, and then you have a team of people saying, well, have we reached those numbers? What are those numbers, you know? But of course, the thing that sits behind that often was that, well, why do we think they're the right targets? So what's actually going to help us deliver them? You then hit into what's the existing evidence, right? And then quite often you hit this further issue, which is, well, crap, maybe there isn't very good evidence. We don't actually know how to do this. And therefore, that's why you want to somehow bring into the mix this possibility of an innovation fund. People clearly want to know more about your 720 million, because I think most governments don't have many of these spaces. They don't have a space where you can say, hey, look, there's a room full of really interesting, crazy people here who've got some interesting ideas. They might work, as I tried to put in my opening remarks today. A lot of them won't work, but we should try them out, right? And to create that safe space in our political systems for our ministers to say, yeah, go a bit crazy, be a bit systematic, and then bolt it back in. So certainly from this side of the Atlantic, it looks a bit like, well, you, Matthew, have helped to kind of design what looks like a system, but maybe you can draw out a bit, well, how well do you think that is right? How have you got a system? And also, in particular, as I said, it's actually, even having done all that, it's quite hard, like the equivalent of the line in the speech, to then make it happen. So maybe draw out a bit about, you know, how do you persuade risk-averse politicians, civil service, to take on these innovative approaches, right? And you've had a sequence of things to doing it, when actually it's turned out quite often it looks like it hasn't been enough.
So let me, I'm going to try and answer a number of questions simultaneously, including yours, because they kind of all bundle together. I mean, I don't want to overstate what we have done in any way. I don't think we have a system in place that is fully mature, that is allowing widespread innovation and experimentation on a daily basis across the government of Canada. I think all of these things are journeys and processes, and we are trying to put in place a number of the pieces. And part of the success factors are, again, a head of government who empowers and entrusts a group or a team, because there are hundreds of decisions that have to get made over time, and you know, I have to feel confident that you know, I can push on certain things and someone has my back. But the risk piece and the social outcomes fund piece, I just want to bring together, because it's really important to try and shift the lens for politicians and decision makers. And that's in the processes and the structures. It's also in terms of our Auditor General, an independent officer who comes and looks at what we do. It's important to change their assessment of what is risk, what is risky, and what gets assessed. Because right now, in the Government of Canada, and this has not changed much, we spend an inordinate amount of time kicking the tires and assessing risk of anything new. We do not just, we don't assess the risk of the status quo, which is commonplace. People always recognize that, well, there's a risk to doing nothing and you have to assess that risk. But we tend not to assess the risks inherent to our current programs. Once the decisions are made, set up a program and it runs on autopilot, and we do not assess the risks in those because they have very clear terms and conditions. We just keep delivering them. We send checks to these people. We deliver programs to these organizations, and those continue to churn. What we are trying to do, and we have not had a ton of success on this front yet, is to help create structures and decision-making processes that compare the risk of an experiment, an innovation, a change to not just the risk of doing nothing, but the risk inherent in the current offerings. Because the current offerings from programs set up 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, are usually just as big, and we spend almost no attention on those. And often organizations like our Auditor General or the media do not spend a ton of time on those. They spend a time focusing on those. So it isn't just persuading politicians, it is also setting up decision-making structures which appropriately weight various risks, including risk of status quo. And our fund is, there are two things, and I mean, I glossed over some of the nuances, and there's a bit of complexity in that. We've actually got two different things going on. We've got a social finance fund of over $1 billion, which is helping not-for-profits capitalize in areas where they would not have been able to invest previously, and where the federal government is putting up kind of concessional capital, at-risk capital, to help those investments. And then the 720 is the combination of the various challenges and outcomes-based funding initiatives that have emerged and that we have co-designed with departments and civil society or stakeholders. So that too is a way of de-risking. So if the federal government is not putting in all of the capital, if communities and cities and not-for-profits and impact investors and philanthropists are making part of the investment and co-developing and co-designing, and having independent civil society members participate in the decisions about what's moving forward, whether things are working or not, a lot of that minimizes risk. A lot of that de-risks the initiative. So even if it doesn't work, the Government of Canada has some small skin in the game, but there are lots of other partners and players. And likewise, in my view, it makes them far more likely to be successful, because experiments co-developed and co-designed by the people who are going to be benefiting. So we have a lot of programs currently underway which we're co-designing with communities of drug users. So opioid crisis, significant in Canada, really looking at the whole range in terms of harm reduction, but also treatment, and a whole range of programs and services co-designed with first responders in the healthcare community, but people who use drugs as well. And so those likewise, we can de-risk I think, for politicians, if you have big buy-in from a wide range of actors who are co-designing the experiment, because a lot of these are experiments with you.
Maybe also, Polly, I'm going to try and draw you in on, because let's segment the conversation and partly the questions coming through. One about the innovation side, like trying to generate the new ideas and creating space for it. And then there are questions around, well, so what, how long will it take to adopt and implement? But let's just do the first bit, as it were, first. I remember early days of the 2010 administration trying to persuade Steve Hilton, who we just mentioned, to say, for God's sake, hold back some funds because you, particularly if anyone knew him, are going to want to do some crazy things. And where's the money to do the crazy bit, right? I mean, to me, there was a supplementary thing, and let's find out whether it works, given, which often, let's face it, ministers often don't want to do. But what would be your assessment now, not least you in Demos or whatever, about the landscape innovation funds and hard evaluation, and you might want to assess how it's going also in Canada, but the Canadians seem to be trying to get it. They've got an over, big fund there, you've got instructions to go and experiment and so on and so on. What's your sense of this bit of the story?
So I think innovation funding is incredibly important. I mean, the first thing that you need to generate new ideas, of course, is democracy is actually a really powerful tool for enabling the replacement of governments and the bringing in of new people who've had nothing to do because they've been in opposition for a few years. And that really does help and is an important kind of construct here. Nevertheless, as you go on in government, you see ministers running out of ideas. Innovation funds to generate opportunities are very important. I think prizes can be very, very powerful. It's also worth remembering, though, that the public sector mustn't be the only client for whom the public sector is interested in generating innovation. And that's partly because some of the reasons why both politicians and public servants are risk-averse are entirely legitimate. The government is trying to serve 100% of the population, and that's an entirely different job from even the most kind of mass market business, a big supermarket, Tesco or whatever. It's trying to serve probably maximum 85, 90% of the population, might go into a Tesco every year. There's the people who are difficult and complicated and hard to reach and hidden and in the grey. They don't have to worry about any of those people, whereas the government does. You can't leave people behind. So if you are thinking about the court service, or you're thinking about, an immigration application form that needs to be online, it's so much more important that it doesn't have flaws than if you are simply selling shoes online, where the worst that can happen is that you lose a customer. And so I think there is an important role for government, not just in supporting innovation of kind of GovTech, but also putting money through research and development funding. We've expanded that here in the UK, and prizes and organisations to just recognise that often part of the story towards the public sector being able to adopt things is a private sector set of innovations that you build something up. And then I think there's also the things around legitimacy that we've just heard around co-design, I think is incredibly important. It's basically at the core of what we do at demos, which is a Greek word that means people, is engage people, because if you do that, you build better ideas from the ground up, but you also build legitimacy that helps you to kind of de-risk change. And we've seen that on massive things like should abortion be legalised in Ireland, but also a much smaller innovations, drug treatment rooms, for example, or whatever they might be.
You're asking some questions here. Can I ask you guys a question, actually, if we are allowed to do that? Which is, how many of you, I'll pause about this, have an idea, maybe draw from the evidence or your own gut instinct, which you think is really, really worth testing, and you have no obvious fund or innovation fund to go to do it? Come on, let's say a show of hands. Is that okay? What have we got, about 20%? Yeah. So that's interesting. To the rest of you, can we just clarify? Is it because you have a good idea, but you have been able to get access to funds? Let's get the counterfactual.
Or do you have no ideas whatsoever?
So there are some, rather fewer, with hands up for that.
And who has no ideas at all?
You have no idea if you have no ideas. No, we're not going to ask you that.
But those are probably the implementers, though, right?
Yeah, maybe. But so a few people have asking questions around this issue of, which comes up recurrently, is that it's often said, we've got these ideas, but actually ministers don't really want to do this, or senior folks want to do it. Where do you see the opposition to doing the new, or indeed doing the experimentation in the system? My own views, but where have you seen it?
The Treasury. They hate new things, as far as I can work out, because they come with this thing, fiscal risk. I don't know if you remember you once wrote a paper about prize-linked savings.
Oh yeah.
Because
right.
Here in the UK we have this what's it called?
Premium bonds.
Premium bonds, yeah. Which has been going since like the dawn of time, and you had all these ideas to innovate and make people able to sort of buy easily, just as easily as they can buy a lottery ticket, all sorts of things. And this was probably 2011 when government borrowing was still going up and up. and up. And the debt management office, the people who actually have to deal with the tedious process of actually issuing government bonds, finding buyers in the market for billions and billions of pounds every week, got wind of David and his, madcap idea to innovate. And they sort of just pulled levers in the Treasury to get the Chancellor and the Chief Secretary and the Financial Secretary, everybody send missives to Number 10, you have to close this down, because anything that was a possible threat to, even £5 worth of, the idea that people might release their premium bonds, because basically it was a sort of, it's held as government debt, and the idea that people might just sell some of them was deeply frightening. And so there is that, the fear of destabilization, of fiscal risk, and that is difficult, and is why, in a way, you need to win the argument in principle, like you say. Let's put some money into something that sounds sexy and fun, like an innovation fund, that they can't then get their hands back on, rather than having to win the argument for every single idea as it comes along, where they all just look risky.
No, Matthew, I'm going to push you on a bit, because the reason why I would deliberately push you on it. As I said, we look with huge admiration, because one of the arguments often said is officials and others say, well, we'd like to do this, but ministers aren't going to want to do this. And then in Canada, you had this overt public set of statements at Prime Minister level and to ministers saying, go take some chances, go experiment. And then, from private conversations I've had, is that didn't lead to a cascade of an energizing, oh my God, they're really saying go for it. So it's like, wait a minute, so that wasn't the barrier after all. So maybe just say a bit more about that.
Yeah, as I talked about, the license and the direction is an important condition, but not a sufficient condition. And my own view is that ministers, because of the nature of this government, because of their personality and background, were very keen to innovate, to experiment. But there are deep structures within public services globally that are not supportive. And there's not an easy answer to your question. There are lots of people who are quite keen on it. There's some people who aren't. But to me, it has to be beyond personality. It has to, you have to focus on the enabling conditions. And so some of the things we focused on were the rule set, some targets around allocating funds for experimentation and reporting on those. But we also did real professional development in a way that most people here would expect, with policy teams to develop skill sets and tools around innovation, because it isn't just, well, let's try something new. There's actually a curriculum and a skill set around how you would design these things, and then certainly how you would measure impact. But we also did professional development in a way that we did not initially expect, which was a hurdle, and I'm just looking through some of these questions, which was a hurdle which should have been obvious to us, but wasn't at the beginning, and I mentioned it earlier, which was other areas of the public service which have to move forward and improve. So there were many instances where a minister would say, let's try this interesting thing. The policy shop would get energized, and you'd go down through the assistant deputy ministers and the directors, and the team would work on the project, and then the lawyers would come back and say, you can't do it. The corporate services people would say that isn't consistent with your authorities. The finance people would say, as a CFO, I can't sign off on this, it's too risky. So there are a whole bunch of chunks within the public service. And I have enormous respect for all of my colleagues, but different professional communities have different values, have different things that they have been trained to do and that they've been rewarded for doing. And certainly a CFO in a large organization is not rewarded for risk-taking. That isn't how they have achieved their position. And and those values are important. There's no doubt that those values are important in all kinds of ways, but they have to be balanced with others. And so we've done more and more professional development and training with other communities that, for some of the policy people, they don't usually, that they see as just kind of a hurdle, like, oh, checkbox, yeah, I got to get the lawyers to sign off on this before we go, or I've got to get the CFO's office to sign off on this before we do this great idea. And so it's really about integrating the full range of knowledge. And I'll be honest that once we did that work, there were some elements of what the CFOs were suggesting that we said, okay, you know what? That actually is useful. That can be integrated. That can improve this. That can de-risk it a little bit. And so it's about, talking to as many of those functional communities within a public service as you can and making sure that they all understand, okay, what are the new terms and conditions that have been set up through Impact Canada that are designed on the direction of the Prime Minister and Cabinet and the head of the public service to facilitate experimentation with pay-for-performance models. How do we do those, and how can I do that? So
let's make sure we pick off one or two of the other questions here. Another one here is around the local, right? Cities and so on, that you get diversity. And in some ways, that's the, democracy, variations in government, city, they are giving us variations all the time, like kind of natural experiments. But it doesn't seem like we're very good often at utilizing that well, if you want to talk to that.
And so something we did, again, in the coalition government, with great hopes that it would transform the landscape, was introduce a general power of competence, to say that local authorities were allowed to do anything they wanted to, so long as it wasn't explicitly illegal. Because so often we got sort of feedback that local authority CFOs or senior managers or lawyers were saying, oh, I'm not sure we've got an explicit power for that. And so we're trying to shift the balance of proof to say, unless you can prove you can't do it, you can do it. And Greg Clark, who was the local government minister, announced at the LGA, the Local Government Association conference, announced, my job is to be a barrier buster for you. So if you're trying to do something and somebody's getting in the way, come to me. I want to make us the department which is sort of, belongs to you. We're the department that is in your service. Completely flip the whole role of government. And to be honest, almost nothing happened. Very few examples of barriers being busted on behalf of local government. And that's, I think, largely because it came at exactly the same time as the government was cutting council budgets by 25% over 2 years, and then with a plan to go on and on and on. And actually, there's a sort of bandwidth issue that, there will be very few local authorities who see a sort of existential change being forced on them in terms of simply the people they employ and the services they run and the bins to collect and the kids to protect, who go, oh yeah, I'm going to innovate now. And that's partly because it's a different group of people necessarily who have ended up in the public sector. So again, another tiny story that I just picked up at the round table earlier was from a Department for Education people conference where there was one standout manager whose people survey response of their team's well-being was like way outlier, so much better than everybody else. So they were giving a speaking slot at the conference for all of the managers. How did you do it? What's the magic? Mm-hmm. And her slide was, don't hire miserable people. She just recruited a different group of people. And you cannot underestimate the importance of having the right kind of people in your team. And all of the economics and dynamics about who goes into different kinds of jobs mean that getting the right kind of people in the public sector is an incredibly important challenge. And recognizing that is why you shouldn't nationalize everything. You can't get all of those people who are risk-taking and entrepreneurial to always work in the public sector. You need a door to go in and out, public and private sector. You need procurement. Actually, the skill set of procurement is one of the most important for the public sector to have. I can't remember where I started, but basically, yeah, hire the right people.
Yes, that's interesting. I'm not sure if saying it's a good or bad thing.
Miserable people need jobs too, right? This is not the solution.
Is it invariant? There are a couple things I want to kind of... By the way, there's a guy here actually came up to say hi, introduce himself. We've been known to the team for a long time. He says, hi, I'm the dog poop man. Maybe in the room, I don't know. Anyway, but actually to give credit, he was one of these... People think that the innovation has to always be big. But he was this great guy who'd actually really been reading some of our stuff. And there's quite a big issue, dog shit, basically. And what are more effective messages to put by bins and say clear it up and so on and so on? I have to say, we spend more time on this than you might think. And like in Spain, they do these little experiments. We put little flags on things. Of course, some place in the world, people collect it. They do DNA testing. They send it back to people. Anyway, is that more or less effective? But my point about it is, actually, in principle, it seems like, how do you create a license? It doesn't necessarily have to be incredibly complicated. It's possible to envisage a world full of kind of public sector entrepreneurs and experimenters who are trying things, right? And isn't that now a challenge? And to support them, and also, we still want to, well, did it work? Which was more effective? So I don't know if you think, like, is that right? Is that wrong? Could we envisage a world where actually, we'll have lots of mini Ben Goldacres out there experimenting on dog poop and everything else?
Well, I think we're moving that way, and one of the things I didn't talk about, but which is in our area of responsibility, is driving the data strategy for the Government of Canada. And certainly when 4 years ago, when the Prime Minister was elected, one of our initial hurdles was him asking questions about things that we did not have data for. And some of them were things that we clearly should have had data for. So obviously, and that's not the focus of this conference, but we are moving into a world, and this raises a whole series of other issues around big data, behavioral data, sensor data, and how cities and communities function organizationally, and how we monitor those things in real time. And there are clearly ethical and legal issues encapsulated within all of this. But regardless of the outcome of some of those discussions and some of the policy choices that governments are going to make, we're obviously in a world where we are going to have much more capacity to understand how people are behaving in real time, and to experiment ethically or unethically with how to influence that behavior. So the dog poop example is, one of millions that one could imagine people are thinking about. Well, how do we make communities, work better so that people don't step in shit, but also so that food gets to where it needs to get to, that bins get collected, the traffic, like all of those things, and then there's a whole second order of those. So 100% we are moving into that world, and I think it's incumbent, certainly amongst all of us as citizens, but for me as a public servant at the moment, to think about how we are designing a policy framework ethically that can achieve some of the good outcomes, but also may sacrifice some of the good outcomes, because we don't want to be in a world where we have that much data that is being controlled by and used by, whether it's big platforms like Google or Facebook, or governments as well. And governments, are subject to a different level of social scrutiny sometimes than the social media platforms. But I think governments are far more responsible and ethical, and we live within a rule set. We think about these questions all of the time about how we deploy and use data. But if we use it wrong once, the criticism that comes down. So we are 100% in that world. And in Canada, we are lucky to pick up on the other question. We are a very devolved country, provincially and municipally. And a lot of our work, we are experimenting at the provincial level when there are opportunities. So the government of Alberta and the cities within Alberta have been much more interested in experimenting in terms of data sharing on opioid use, and real-time use of fentanyl, like contaminated opioids, overdoses, risk, et cetera. And so we're experimenting at the local level with them on that. And in other communities, it will be with other things. So many Indigenous communities starting to experiment on how to build community infrastructure in better ways. So I think of Canada, and we talk about this in our academic literature in poli-sci, in the political sciences, provinces are really places where we experiment with lots of our social programs, and then those that work get ideally scaled up. Often it's a good idea, someone likes it, it isn't working, but because it was catchy, it gets scaled up anyway, so that's a whole other issue. But certainly I think that working with interested cities and provinces is a great idea.
So we should wind up shortly, I think. I'm looking at it. I just want to draw you out, maybe to make your closing remarks, but to draw your attention to particularly a couple of questions. One is a very concrete one, Matthew, you might want to think about, which is around, if you're going to do this, are you better off to take, do you need separate behavioural insight teams, or are you better doing them in a different way? Because obviously Canada actually, although you've got, Liz Hardy who's here or whatever, doing that, but actually you have seem to be deliberately done it a broader way. Do you have a view about that? But also other ones you want to reflect on, which are running through this. Is there an example, maybe Polly would have one as well, where something was tried out, it really didn't work, and then how the hell do you handle the politics of that? Well, you've been able to handle that well. And again, I'll give you a real example. Talked to Francis Maude, who was a minister previously. He wanted to create a prize, which was to be, as part of Civil Service Awards, which would be for the best idea that didn't work. But it actually got filtered, it got turned into, it does exist now, it's the Innovation Prize. And he said, when the first round came in, of the 79 things, of the 80 things, 79 were things that did work. It's like really hard to extract from the system. And so also, maybe just conclude, if you want to, is this issue about, I love this, it's anonymous, but in brackets from a HM Treasury official. What's the first thing you should do within an organization to kickstart cultural change and attitudes to risk experimentation? So anyway, maybe you could specifically deal with this BI versus general, think about a kind of risk, and then that general one or other closing comments you want to.
Yeah, I mean, those are all good questions, and I think, I've dealt with some of those implicitly or explicitly so far. What I would say is, from my perspective and experience, what we have tried to do is avoid the binary choice between a centralized behavioral insights unit or a centralized innovation unit and innovation units within organizations. Our federal public service is quite decentralized. Departments have their own cultures and own authorities, and Westminster system and ministers and deputies, particularly in some departments, guard those very much. So what we've tried to do is triangulate a bit and created a central team, but as I mentioned, through that central team have hired external capacity and skills, and people with some of the skills that people have here, but people who may be coming into the public service for 2 years or 4 years, as you mentioned, and hopefully move in and out, and placed them within departments. So departments that already have said, we're interested in this, and they've integrated those people into their policy teams or their delivery teams. Some have set up their own results and delivery units, and integrated people with BI. But, as we've talked about, behavioral science, this whole discussion is, evolving rapidly, and it's about people who understand user-centered design and design theory and choice theory and a whole series of other approaches to program delivery. And so having people with a wide range of expertise, but also continuing to bring them together as part of a community. So part of the goal has been to have people in departments who are working on series of projects and trying to inform the policy and program decision-making choices that are being made within departments, but linking those in a community of practice that we bring together on a regular basis. And one of the experiments we've done, which I think is successful, but I don't have quantitative data yet, is that what we have done with this team is secured agreement from the departments that their members would be mostly working on projects in their department, but they would also participate in other projects at other departments. So trying to share the learnings that might be user-centered design, but behavioral science. So we at Defense are undertaking this project, I'm involved with this, but that person is also learning from something that may be going on at the Department of Immigration, and participating as a member of that team. And that team is not just a BI team, it is a program delivery team that may have a couple of people with behavioral science capacity, but people with other things as well. So we have tried to build that ecosystem. I think it's working, but I don't know that we know that yet.
Very good. Holly, any other closing thoughts, comments?
Yeah, I mean, so it's often said when a woman is rubbish at something, right? I'm going somewhere with this, I promise. People are sort of make that woman sort of accountable for all womankind for being dreadful, whereas when a man is dreadful, it's just him, you know. And it's often said in kind of feminist circles that real achievement of equality will be when mediocre women are in charge of all sorts of things, because mediocre men have been in charge for, you know, most of human history.
But not now.
Not now.
Not now. Everything looks good.
Yeah, totally. And I come to that thought from this, you know, freedom to succeed and freedom to fail being kind of the same thing. In that, actually, this poorly conceived ideas to take off. Poorly conceived ideas have been taking off and being government money wasted on them for like generations. You know, at the moment we're wasting billions on a really poorly conceived benefits redesign. That could have been really good, but has been, you know, eaten away by. Anyway, we could talk about that for hours. And so I think actually, change does happen. The problem is sometimes we make too big bets. Well, instead of recognizing that what you should do is 5 little things and see which one of them works. Persuading politicians to do that is a challenge, but actually, I think the answer to this big failures and big successes is to go for smaller scale. And thinking about the first question of, you know, especially within the Treasury has all this guidance on stuff, right? There's a red book and a green book and I believe a magenta book. I feel like there should be a coloured book about how to do risk, because what you have, you know, with sales and persuasion, you have to turn it into the other person's language. How do you think about risk and risk for the good from that kind of Treasury official perspective? So I think, yeah, that's my new job, maybe.
Very good. Very good. Thank you. We should wind up shortly. I should say, I think it's fantastic what's happening in Canada. We're going to watch with great interest. Actually, BIT, as you know, also partly your invitation is set up a small team in Canada now, which we also hope will help in the mix. I should also credit, I remember this moment, which seemed to me was an incredible moment in government, where we were having this discussion and argument about a big policy issue, actually was to do with DWP and mental health training and extra support to get people back to work faster. And it was chaired by Nick Clegg, the then Deputy Prime Minister who Polly advised. And there was this wonderful moment where you could see these two departments disagreeing, and he just said, well, wouldn't it be better to resolve this with a randomized control trial? It's like, oh my God, we've got Deputy Prime Minister who says the words randomized control trial. I've actually died and gone to heaven. But my final answer, just we can conclude, and we have made some progress. We have, of course, rewritten the Green Book in the UK with Treasury colleagues. But in answer to that question, I do think, to borrow from another framework, many of us will know, the COM-B framework is not a bad place to start to apply it back to this problem. What is the capability of the organizations? Do they have the skills? Do they know what to do? Do they know how to run a trial? Actually, and even innovating, it turns out being creative is quite difficult. Do they have an opportunity? What were the rules? What were the barriers? Have you made it really clear? And then finally, this point about motivation. To be able to get actually powerful examples where we do try something new and something wonderful came from it, as well as actually celebrate, you tried something good and it didn't work, and that's also all right. And we have to get to a world where ministers, as said, public and others, are also comfortable with that. Probably a few innovation funds. I think many of us could do with a similar Canadian-style 700 million innovation fund. That might also help too. All right, anyway, thank you very much, Matthew, flying across to join us, and Polly, and you all for taking part.